Big Shaq finds Connor steal Braxton, the rival who once tried to break him, now shattered on the streets. But what Big Shaq does next isn't just shocking, it's a move that sends shockwaves through the NBA and forces the world to question everything they thought they knew about redemption, pride, and the true meaning of strength. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun cast long shadows down a stretch of cracked asphalt, where once vibrant murals had faded into pale ghosts of color. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, though no one here dared call him that to his face, guided his gleaming Escalade through the neglected neighborhood, windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of dust and heat. He didn't drive through this part of town often anymore, not because he'd forgotten his roots, but because each boarded-up shopfront and graffitied wall pressed reminders into him, memories of struggle, of narrow escapes from fists clenched not in sport but survival. Yet something today had drawn him down this road, an inexplicable tug that gnawed at him like unfinished business. As he approached the sagging remains of what had once been the Bellevue Diner, the Escalade's tires crunched over broken glass and grit. Shaq's gaze snagged on a figure slumped against the charred doorframe. The man was a collapsed sketch of former strength, draped in a filthy jacket too thin for the breeze now creeping between the alleys. His hair, once neat and cropped, hung in greasy tufts, and his face, still recognizable beneath grime and hollow cheeks, tilted just enough for Shaq to catch a glimpse of those ice-blue eyes. Connor Steele Braxton. The name hit Shaq like a slap he hadn't seen coming. He hadn't heard Connor's name whispered in years, not since the headlines had moved on, burying scandal and disgrace beneath the fresh glow of newer stars. Steele had been his nemesis on the hardwood, his foil in countless on-court battles, a man who thrived on venomous words whispered between plays, his voice slicing with mockery. Their rivalry had extended beyond the court, bleeding into charity events, award nights, and even casual encounters at public gatherings. But all of that had been years ago, before Connor's collapse, before the scandal that had stripped him of endorsements, respect, and a place to call his own. Shaq's foot hovered over the gas pedal, instinct pulling him to keep driving, to leave the wreckage of a man to whatever end he'd chosen. Yet, the sight of Connor's bent frame, shoulders shuddering as though he were fighting some silent war with himself, rooted Shaq in place. There was no recognition on Connor's face, no flash of challenge or the sly smirk that once accompanied every encounter. Only the hollow-eyed emptiness of someone long beaten by more than an opponent, someone whose fight had been drained and discarded. The Escalade idled as Shaq's thoughts tangled. He remembered the way Connor's laughter had echoed across the court during that fateful game in Miami. The subtle barbs he'd delivered into the microphone just loud enough for reporters to catch, twisted remarks that played on race, family, and reputation. Shaq had held back then, silenced by the invisible lines he'd been taught not to cross, lines that men like Connor crossed with impunity. It had eaten at him afterward, the injustice of silence, the weight of the moment slipping through his grasp like so many others. But now, sitting in the dim glow of a failing sun with Connor broken and forgotten on a street corner, Shaq felt a different pull. He felt the weight of his mother Lucille's voice, the lessons she'd etched into his marrow. To be the bigger man, to offer a hand even when it trembled with anger. He shifted the gear into park, and let the silence settle around him. Connor hadn't moved, hadn't noticed the luxury SUV idling nearby. A gust of wind stirred litter at his feet, sending an empty soda can rattling down the street. Shaq opened the door and stepped out, his sneakers crunching against scattered debris. The air smelled faintly of smoke, a memory trapped in the cracked bricks of the abandoned diner. Connor's head turned slowly. The movement labored as though it had been days since he'd dared lift it. His eyes flicked up, dull and lifeless, barely registering Shaq's towering figure. Shaq stood for a long moment, arms crossed loosely, his expression unreadable. The years of rivalry, of backhanded compliments and subtle sabotage, played in his mind like a reel. Yet now, in this quiet space where there were no fans to impress, no cameras to capture the encounter, none of it seemed to matter. "You need a ride?" Shaq's voice was low, rough from disuse in this forgotten part of town. He kept it steady, offering no hint of superiority or condescension. Connor's mouth worked silently, the first crack in his guarded expression. His hands trembled where they rested on his knees, dirt smudging the pale skin. For a heartbeat, Shaq thought he might lash out with a sharp refusal, some remnant of the old steel rising to claw back dignity. But instead Connor merely lowered his gaze, the fight draining from his posture like water slipping through broken fingers. "Don't need charity," he rasped, his voice cracked and dry as old paper. Shaq shifted his weight, hands sliding into the pockets of his track pants. "A ride's not charity. It's a choice." The words hung between them, a delicate bridge over a chasm of old resentment and unspoken guilt. The wind stirred again, colder now, and Shaq could almost hear his father's voice reminding him that a man's strength wasn't measured by his victories, but by the grace he extended to others. Connor exhaled a shuddering breath, the sound hollow against the distant hum of traffic. Slowly, painfully, he levered himself upright, using the wall for balance. Shaq watched without offering a hand, sensing that Connor needed the small dignity of standing on his own. When he finally straightened, his clothes hung off his frame like forgotten fabric, and his eyes, though dull, flickered with a hint of something old. Recognition, maybe, or the barest ember of defiance. Without another word, Shaq turned and opened the passenger door of the Escalade. The interior light spilled out, catching on the deep lines etched into Connor's face. After a pause that stretched long enough to fray nerves, Connor shuffled forward, each step stiff and uncertain. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle as though it were a snake poised to strike. Shaq didn't rush him, didn't push. Finally, with a faint, almost inaudible sigh, Connor climbed inside, settling into the plush seat with a wince. Shaq closed the door gently, then rounded to the driver's side, sliding behind the wheel. As the engine hummed beneath them, the silence stretched thick and uneasy. Connor stared out the window, his reflection warped by grime and fading light. Shaq let the quiet sit between them, not out of discomfort, but respect for the gravity of this moment, the fall of a rival, the rise of something unspoken between them. The Escalade rolled forward, tires smoothing over rough pavement, carrying them into a night heavy with memory. Neither man spoke as they left the diner behind, the weight of old grudges left to smolder in the darkening streets. Shaq didn't glance at Connor again, didn't ask for explanations or apologies. He simply drove, letting the road unwind ahead, silent witness to a story still unfolding. The Escalade rumbled down the cracked streets, headlights cutting a narrow path through the growing dusk. Inside, Shaq's hands rested loosely on the wheel, eyes fixed forward, but his mind churned with memories that played like static in the quiet. Connor Steele Braxton had once been a man impossible to ignore, a force of nature with a sharp tongue and sharper elbows, whose name buzzed louder than most in arenas and post-game interviews. On the court, he wasn't just aggressive. He was venomous, twisting plays into moments of spectacle, baiting opponents with smirks and whispered jabs. But it wasn't only his game that made him a fixture in every sports column. It was the unspoken sense that Steele wasn't afraid to step beyond the lines of decency. Shaq had crossed paths with Connor too many times to count, each encounter leaving an aftertaste of frustration and quiet fury. Their rivalry hadn't been confined to the court. It bled into charity galas, where Steele would lean in close with a murmured insult only Shaq could hear, or into press conferences where he'd frame his victories with underhanded remarks, always skirting just shy of outright slander. Shaq had learned early on that walking away from Connor wasn't a sign of weakness but of restraint, a lesson carved deep by the watchful, disapproving gaze of his mother, Lucy. But then came the night that rewrote everything, a charity event meant to shine a spotlight on community rebuilding, where Connor's barbed words finally pierced the thin veil of civility he had so carefully maintained. The whispers started small, an overheard slur spoken behind the glass walls of the VIP lounge. Someone caught the words on their phone, the video shaky but damning, the audio clear enough to draw gasps when it hit the internet hours later. Connor, flanked by sponsors and agents, his glass raised in a mocking toast, uttered words so steeped in contempt that they couldn't be misinterpreted. The fallout was swift and brutal. Sponsors dropped him within days, releasing carefully worded statements of condemnation. The league, once willing to overlook his provocations for the sake of ratings and ticket sales, issued a lifetime ban under the weight of public outcry. His so-called friends, once eager to ride his coattails, evaporated like mist in the face of scandal. The man who had thrived on visibility suddenly found himself invisible, shunned by the very world that once fed his arrogance. Shaq had watched it unfold from a distance, torn between a grim satisfaction that justice had finally caught up with Connor, and a hollow sadness that it had taken so long. He recalled overhearing snatches of conversations in locker rooms, players speaking in hushed tones about the video, about the sponsors that fled like rats from a sinking ship, about the family that disowned Connor with a silence louder than any statement. His wife's name, Madison, had disappeared from the gossip columns, her absence noted only by its starkness. His brother, once a fixture at courtside seats, deleted every photo of them together from social media, scrubbing the digital traces of their bond. As the Escalade crept past the boarded-up windows of forgotten shops, Shaq's thoughts circled back to those final days of Connor's visibility, where every headline blared the same themes: disgraced, fallen, unforgiven. But it wasn't just the public that had turned on him. It was the private unraveling that twisted the knife deeper. His wealth, built on endorsements and appearance fees, dried up in legal fees and settlement. His house, a sprawling modern monstrosity on the outskirts of town, was seized by creditors and auctioned off in a spectacle that drew more onlookers than his last press conference. Shaq could still hear the echo of his mother's voice reminding him, long before he was famous, that pride had a way of breaking a man from the inside out. Pride wasn't strength, it was a brittle mask, and once it cracked, there was nothing beneath to hold a man upright. Looking at Connor's hunched figure earlier, Shaq recognized that truth written in every tremor of his hands, every hollow gaze cast toward the ground. He recalled the street whispers that had filled the air after the scandal, spoken not with sympathy, but with the casual cruelty reserved for fallen idols. They said Connor had tried to stage a comeback, to pivot into business ventures that failed faster than they launched, that he'd shown up at charity games, uninvited and unwelcome, his presence an uncomfortable reminder of a time everyone wanted to forget, that he'd been spotted at cheap bars, trying to buy drinks on credit that no one was willing to extend. The once sleek, confident man had become a shadow of himself, his name spoken in the past tense, as if he were already gone. The silence in the SUV grew heavier, punctuated only by the hum of tires over uneven asphalt. Shaq's grip on the wheel tightened imperceptibly. He wasn't one to gloat over a man's downfall, no matter how bitter the history, but he couldn't ignore the tangle of aggression and pity coiling in his chest. Connor had been given every opportunity, every advantage, and he had squandered them with arrogance and cruelty. Yet now, seeing him crumpled against a burned-out diner, Shaq realized the deeper tragedy wasn't in Connor's fall, but in his refusal to let go of the shell of who he used to be. He glanced briefly at the passenger seat, where Connor sat stiff and silent, eyes averted. There was no hint of the sharp-tongued rival here, only a man hollowed out by his own missteps, clinging to remnants of pride too tattered to offer shelter. Shaq thought of his own journey, the narrow escapes from bad choices, the moments where his mother's words had anchored him just long enough to pull back from the edge. The difference between them wasn't just fame or talent, it was the willingness to listen, to learn, to change. Connor, for all his charm and skill, had never learned that lesson. And now, as the city lights shimmered faintly on the horizon, Shaq understood that Connor's real defeat had nothing to do with bans or bankruptcies. It was the quiet, gnawing truth that he had been his own undoing. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt leading out of the forgotten neighborhood. Shaq pressed his foot gently on the accelerator, letting the Escalade glide forward into the deepening twilight. Connor remained silent, his reflection flickering ghost-like in the window. There was no apology, no explanation, no confrontation, only the weight of what had been lost, and the quiet acknowledgement of a fall from grace too complete for easy redemption. As Shaq steered the Escalade through the hushed backstreets, the silence around him thickened, not with the sounds of the city, but with the echo of his own conflicted thoughts. Connor Steele Braxton's figure, so slight, so broken, lingered in his mind like an unwelcome ghost. For a man who had once towered in arenas, Connor's downfall was almost too sharp to believe. Yet the image wasn't enough to scrub away the old, stubborn sting of memory, a memory that Shaq had locked deep within himself but could never quite silence. It had happened years ago, on a night meant to celebrate. The finals were over, a grueling stretch that had seen Shaq's team fall just short of victory. Shaq had pushed himself harder than he ever had before. The weight of expectations, his own, his family's, the crowds pressing down until his body felt like it might shatter. But it wasn't the loss that haunted him. It was what happened afterward, in the glitzy after-party where champagne flowed and cameras buzzed like bees around honey. Connor had cornered him near the bar, glass in hand, smile sharp as a blade. His words, low and precise, sliced through the hum of conversation. Guess some people just can't handle the pressure. Huh. Big guy. Can't carry the weight when it counts. Maybe you should stick to charity games where it's easy to look like the hero. The words were bait, meant to draw blood. But Shaq, years younger then, raw with disappointment, had refused to take it. He'd clenched his jaw, forced a tight smile and turned away. But Connor hadn't stopped. "You know," he'd added, his voice dropping to a murmur laced with venom, "some people just don't belong at the top. They're tolerated but never truly respected, no matter how many points they put on the board." His gaze, cold and glittering, met Shaq's, as if daring him to react, knowing full well that the cameras nearby would catch every second. Shaq had felt his fists curl at his sides, his mother's voice in his head telling him to breathe, to remember his father's quiet strength. That night, Shaq had swallowed his pride, his anger, and the deep, gnawing humiliation that settled into his chest like a stone. The headlines the next day had praised Connor's competitive spirit, downplaying the incident as locker room banter. No one but Shaq had known how those words had cut, how they'd echoed in his mind during practices, in the quiet moments before games, in the stillness of hotel rooms where he tried to shake off the weight of them. Now, as the city's dim glow stretched in the distance, Shaq felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He'd wanted to forget that night, to believe that time and success could erase its sting, but seeing Connor now, reduced, hollow-eyed, a man stripped of the armor of fame, brought those old wounds surging back. Shaq wrestled with a jumble of emotions, a flicker of pity, the faintest taste of triumph, but mostly a deep, unresolved ache he hadn't realized still lived within him. He remembered his father's face, rough with years of labor, but always softened when speaking of dignity. His father had taught him that real strength wasn't in fists or sharp words, but in restraint. A man who lets bitterness lead him, his father used to say, becomes a prisoner of his own anger. "Stand tall, son. Let your silence speak louder than their noise." It was a lesson Shaq had carried into every press conference, every public appearance where he'd bitten back the urge to lash out, to reclaim his pride. That promise, whispered silently at his father's funeral, had anchored Shaq through countless storms, the media circus, the betrayals by friends, the pressures of expectations. It had reminded him to step back, to think before acting. But tonight, that promise felt heavy, tangled with the sight of Connor slumped in defeat. Was this what his father had meant? To stand tall even when every instinct screamed for vindication. The SUV rolled to a gentle stop, at a red light. Shaq drummed his fingers lightly against the steering wheel. His jaw set, his mind replaying the fragments of that long-ago confrontation. He could still hear the smirking laughter, see the gleam of cameras catching his forced calm. He remembered the sensation of his pride shrinking under the weight of a public insult he hadn't answered. That night, Connor had left the party basking in the glow of perceived victory, while Shaq had driven home in silence, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles ached. But now, the roles were reversed. Shaq was the one behind the wheel, steady and calm, while Connor was the one crushed by his own hubris. Yet the weight in Shaq's chest wasn't the satisfaction he'd thought it might be. It was something quieter, heavier. The realization that watching Connor crumble didn't erase the hurt, didn't rewrite the past. It only deepened the understanding of how much strength it had taken to walk away, to honor a promise made to a father who believed in dignity over retaliation. As the light turned green, Shaq eased forward, his grip loosening slightly. He glanced at Connor's reflection in the side mirror, huddled, small, a man unraveling under the weight of his own missteps. And for the first time in years, Shaq let the memory of that finals night settle into something less sharp, less raw. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of seeing Connor not as a rival, or a villain, but as a man broken by his own pride. Shaq's thoughts shifted, threading back through the years, to moments where he himself had teetered on the edge, when the anger bubbled too hot, when the easy path was to snap back, to prove his strength with words, or gestures that might have satisfied the moment, but left a stain on his soul. He remembered his mother's quiet hand on his shoulder, his father's steady voice. He remembered choosing silence, not out of weakness, but out of respect for himself and his family. That, he realized now, was the true victory. Not the points scored or the endorsements won. Not the accolades that crowded his shelf, but the ability to look in the mirror and know he'd honored his father's lesson. Connor had chosen noise and spectacle, had grasped at pride until it slipped through his fingers. Shaq had chosen silence, and now, as he glanced at the man slumped in his passenger seat, he understood the weight of that choice in a way he never had before. The Escalade rolled on, carrying them both through streets thick with memory. Outside, the city stirred, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding inside the car. Shaq's hands rested lightly on the wheel, his gaze forward, his heart heavy but steady. He wasn't there to gloat, to punish, to replay old humiliations. He was there to remember, to reflect, and just maybe, to begin the slow, quiet work of releasing a burden he'd carried for far too long. Outside, the late afternoon sun baked the asphalt, sending shimmering waves up from the pavement. Connor sat slouched against the passenger door, his breath ragged, his frame tense. The weight of silence wrapped around them both, like a taut cord threatening to snap. Shaq glanced at him once, briefly enough to see the twitch of Connor's jaw, the flush creeping up his neck. The man's pride, once the armor he had strutted behind, now sat like a millstone pulling him deeper into self-loathing. Shaq could almost hear the internal war, the echo of a man who had once barked commands on court sidelines, reduced to quiet defiance. But there was no pleasure in the sight, only the quiet echo of something his father had said long ago. When a man falls, son, you don't kick him, you offer him your hand. For a long stretch of moments, Shaq said nothing. Then, with a steady breath, he reached over and unlocked the passenger door with a faint click. The sound echoed in the heavy silence. Connor's head jerked slightly at the noise, his eyes narrowing in suspicion, though they still refused to meet Shaq's. The older man didn't speak. He simply let his actions fill the space between them. A silent invitation, no grand gestures, no condescension, just the simple, quiet presence of someone willing to help. Connor's mouth twitched, his pride warring with his hunger, his stubborn refusal clashing against the growling in his stomach. His hands curled into fists on his lap, nails biting into the grime under his skin. His voice, when it finally scraped out, was rough, almost a snarl. I don't need your charity. But the words faltered at the end, as if even he couldn't quite summon the conviction to make them sting. Shaq kept his gaze steady, his voice low and even. Ain't charity, Connor. Just a ride, a warm meal maybe. You look like you could use both. His words were plain, stripped of any judgment or pity, but they pressed down like a quiet weight, the kind that demanded honesty rather than bluster. Connor's stomach growled audibly, a sound so stark against the silence that it made his face flush darker. His shoulders sagged just a fraction, the fight bleeding out of him like air from a punctured tire. His pride had been his shield, but now, faced with Shaq's calm, unwavering presence, it felt brittle, almost childish. He opened his mouth to retort, to lash out, but found nothing. No words, no fire, only the sharp sting of reality pressing down on him like a vice. With a sharp breath that sounded more like defeat than acquiescence, Connor leaned forward slightly, his voice low and bitter. Fine. Just one ride. He spat the words out as if they burned his tongue, but Shaq didn't react. He simply nodded once, a quiet acceptance that spoke louder than any grand pronouncement could have. The Escalade eased back onto the cracked road, tires crunching softly against gravel as they rolled forward. Neither man spoke immediately, the silence stretching between them like an invisible thread. Shaq kept his hand steady on the wheel, his gaze forward. Connor slumped against the passenger seat, eyes half-lidded, exhaustion pressing down on him like a lead blanket. As they drove, the town unfolded around them in faded snapshots, murals of civil rights leaders, their faces painted in bold, defiant colors, loomed over boarded-up storefronts. Empty lots, littered with broken glass and sagging fences, whispered of promises never kept. The remnants of once thriving neighborhoods now stood as silent witnesses to time's cruel march, the contrast between resilience and ruin stark against the setting sun. Shaq's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low, thoughtful. My father used to bring me through this part of town when I was a kid, he said, his tone laced with memory but free of bitterness. He'd drive slow, point to those murals, those old churches, the playgrounds where kids' laughter used to echo. He'd say, these streets remember. They remember who stood tall, who kept their word, who tried to make things right. His lips twitched in the faintest shadow of a smile. He always believed redemption wasn't about speeches or cameras. It was about action. Quiet, steady action. Connor's gaze flicked toward him, the lines of defiance around his mouth softening just a hair. His voice was low, almost a mutter. Sounds like your old man was a saint. Shaq's laugh was short, almost bitter. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. Big ones. But he owned up to them. That's what made him a man worth remembering. He let the words settle, unhurried. He taught me that the real weight a man carries isn't his past. It's what he does with it now. They passed a park where the swings hung still and silent in the fading light. Connor's shoulders twitched, his jaw tightening as if some unseen hand was winding him tighter and tighter. "You don't know what it's like," he said quietly, the words cracking like glass. "To be hated, to be spit on, to have people turn their backs because of one mistake." Shaq's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice remained steady. "Don't I?" he said softly. "You think it was easy for me, walking into arenas, hearing whispers, seeing the headlines twist my words, feeling eyes on me that didn't care if I dropped 30 points. They just saw a black man, a target, someone they could cut down with a look or a word. I know what it's like to carry that weight, but I had a choice. Let it bury me, or stand taller than the hate." Connor's breath hitched, the bitterness faltering for a heartbeat before he masked it again. "Easy to talk about standing tall when you're driving a damn Escalade, when you've got the world at your feet." Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line, but his voice was quiet. "You think this," he said, gesturing at the car, "is what makes me strong. It's not the money, it's not the fame, it's remembering where I came from. Remembering who taught me to be better, and knowing I still have a long way to go." The road curved past a boarded-up church with peeling white paint, its cross barely visible against the darkening sky. Shaq's voice softened, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to Connor. "My father said redemption isn't a one-time thing. It's a choice you make every day. To do better, to lift others when you can, to forgive yourself, not because it erases what you did, but because it lets you start again." Connor's hands trembled faintly, his face turned toward the window. But his reflection in the glass was a study in conflict. Pride warring with regret, anger battling exhaustion. The hunger in his gut was more than just for food. It was for a chance to feel human again, to claw his way back from the edge he'd teetered on for so long. The Escalade rolled to a stop in front of a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly against the deepening twilight. Shaq killed the engine and turned to Connor, his voice calm, unwavering. "Let's get something to eat. Then we'll figure out what's next." Connor hesitated, his pride clawing at him one last time. But Shaq's steady gaze, the quiet strength of a man who had every reason to turn away but chose to stay, finally cracked through the walls he'd built around himself. With a slow, reluctant nod, Connor uncurled his fists, his shoulders sagging just a little. He opened the door and stepped out, the first small step towards something he didn't yet understand, but could no longer refuse. The diner on the edge of town wore its years like a badge, peeling paint on the window frames, a neon sign, buzzing faintly against the thickening dusk, and the scent of fried potatoes and old coffee seeping from every crack in the walls. Shaq eased the Escalade into the lot, its tires crunching against gravel, and he killed the engine with a soft click. Connor sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring ahead, hands clenched tight on his knees. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Shaq, without a word, stepped out and rounded the front of the vehicle. He pulled open Connor's door, standing there, waiting. The silence between them was thick but not suffocating. It was the weight of things unspoken, of choices made and chances still waiting to be seized. Connor's lips tightened, his pride a thin thread stretched nearly to breaking, but the gnawing in his gut, the bitter taste of exhaustion, finally won. With a curt nod, he swung his legs out, his movements slow and stiff, and followed Shaq toward the diner's door. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the scent of comfort food and the low murmur of a few scattered patrons. At the counter, Velma stood polishing a stack of mismatched mugs, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun, her eyes sharp and knowing, flicked up as the bell above the door jingled. For a second she said nothing. Recognition dawned first in her gaze as it landed on Shaq, then deepened when it fell on Connor's disheveled frame. But she kept her silence, her lips pressing into a thin line as she nodded once, briskly, and motioned them toward a booth in the corner. Shaq guided Connor to the vinyl bench, the older man's shoulders hunched inward as if trying to fold himself into invisibility. Velma approached without a word, sliding 2 menus onto the table before disappearing into the kitchen, her movements efficient and unsentimental. Shaq leaned back against the booth's high back, his large hands resting lightly on the table, while Connor sat stiffly across from him, his eyes darting around as though searching for an escape route. After a moment, Velma returned, setting down 2 iced teas and a basket of cornbread. Still, she said nothing. Shaq nodded his thanks, and she turned away, leaving them cocooned in silence, punctuated only by the clink of dishes and the soft murmur of a radio playing something low and twangy in the background. Connor's fingers hovered uncertainly over the cornbread before finally snatching a piece, tearing it apart with nervous, jerky movements. Shaq watched him quietly, his own glass of iced tea untouched, condensation tracing lazy paths down its surface. The silence stretched, a fragile thread between them, until Connor broke it with a voice roughened by weariness and shame. "Been homeless for 5 years," he muttered, barely louder than a breath. His eyes flicked up, met Shaq's for a fleeting second, then darted away. "After the scan, couldn't get work, couldn't face my family. They cut me off. Friends stopped calling. Fans turned into ghosts. Couldn't even walk into a grocery store without hearing the whispers." His laugh was short, sharp, and bitter. "Guess that's what happens when you fall off the pedestal, huh?" Shaq's face remained impassive, his gaze steady. He sipped his iced tea, the ice clinking faintly against the glass, and said nothing. Connor's hands trembled slightly as he picked at the cornbread. "I thought I could ride it out, wait for the storm to pass. But it didn't. It just kept coming, until there was nothing left but me in the street." His lips twisted in a humorless smile. "I kept telling myself I was too good for the shelters, too proud for the soup kitchens. But pride doesn't keep you warm at night, doesn't fill your belly." He slumped forward, elbows on the table, his voice cracking. "I hated you for a long time, Shaq. I blamed you for everything. Told myself you were the one who got me banned, who turned everyone against me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't you, it was me. My choices. My arrogance." Shaq's face softened, just a fraction. Still, he said nothing. Connor's breath hitched, and for a long moment he seemed to teeter on the edge of confession. Then, with a sharp exhale, he finally let the words spill out, bitter and raw. "I sabotaged you," he said quietly, each word falling like a stone into still water. "That charity event you were running, years ago, for those kids in the projects. I leaked lies to the press, made it seem like you were skimming off the top. I was jealous, spiteful, couldn't stand watching you play the hero while I stood in your shadow." The admission hung between them, thick and heavy. Even the low hum of conversation from the other patrons seemed to falter for a heartbeat. Velma behind the counter paused in her wiping of glasses, her eyes narrowing as she glanced over, but she said nothing, her gaze dropping back to her task with a slow shake of her head. Shaq's reaction was not what Connor expected. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even frown. He simply lifted his glass again, sipped his tea, and set it down with deliberate calm. His gaze remained steady, his voice low and unhurried. "That's a hell of a confession, Connor." Connor's laugh was hollow. "Yeah, well, guess it's too late for sorry now, huh?" Shaq's lips curved, the faintest hint of a smile though there was no humor in it. "Maybe. Or maybe it's the first thing you've done right in a long time." The silence thickened again, but this time it was different, less suffocating, more contemplative. Connor sat back, his shoulders slumping, his breath coming a little easier now that the truth was out, raw and unvarnished. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding behind bitterness or bravado. Shaq tapped the side of his glass lightly with one thick finger. The sound soft but deliberate. "You think redemption's about a grand gesture? About fixing everything overnight?" His voice was low, almost thoughtful. "It's not. It's about owning what you did, facing it, and then doing the next right thing, one step at a time." Connor's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his gaze falling to the half-empty basket of cornbread. His voice, when it came, was rough but quieter. "Don't even know what the next right thing is." Shaq's gaze met his, steady and calm. "You'll figure it out, if you want to." They sat there for a while longer, the tension easing slightly, the silence between them less jagged, more like the quiet after a storm. Velma brought over their plates, hearty meals of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green. She set them down without a word, but her glance toward Connor was softer now, her lips pressing into something that almost resembled approval. Shaq picked up his fork, nodding toward the plate in front of Connor. "Eat, then we'll figure out where you're sleeping tonight." And for the first time in years, Connor did as he was told. The ride to Shaq's estate unfolded under the muted glow of streetlights, the occasional flicker of headlights washing over Connor's pale, hollow face. He sat stiffly in the Escalade's passenger seat, his hands curled into fists against his thighs, his eyes darting nervously toward Shaq, then away, as if uncertain what to say or whether to say anything at all. Shaq, for his part, drove in a silence so profound it seemed almost physical. the weight of their shared past pressing down on them both like an unseen hand. When they finally pulled into the long, winding drive leading up to Shaq's home, Connor's breath hitched. The estate wasn't ostentatious or sprawling with the kind of gold-plated flash he might have once associated with wealth. Instead, it was large but inviting, a broad, single-level structure that sprawled comfortably beneath old oaks draped in Spanish moss. Warm light spilled from windows that hinted at a life within, a family's laughter echoing against the walls, the scent of home-cooked meals wafting through the air. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a sanctuary. Shaq parked near the garage and cut the engine. For a long moment, he didn't move, just sat with his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed ahead, as though gathering his thoughts. Connor shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. Finally, with a low sigh, Shaq opened his door and stepped out, his broad frame silhouetted against the gentle glow from the house. He didn't say a word, just waited, his presence calm and steady. Connor hesitated, then followed, his steps faltering as he took in the sight of the house. His eyes flicked toward the windows, where the faint outlines of figures moved. Shaq's family, no doubt, gathered in the living room, watching the arrival of the unexpected guest with a mix of curiosity and unease. His pulse quickened, and he fought the instinct to turn and bolt back into the shadows of the night. But something, whether the exhaustion pulling at his bones or the quiet resolve in Shaq's posture, kept his feet moving. Shaq led him through the front door, which opened without a knock. The inside of the house was warm, filled with the faint scent of pinwood and the comforting clutter of a lived-in home. Photographs lined the walls, snapshots of Shaq's children at graduations and birthday parties, of his mother Lucille, her face beaming with pride, and of moments that spoke of family, of memories both cherished and ordinary. The living room was bathed in a soft golden glow from a lamp near the couch. Shaq's children were there, his tall son with the quiet, steady gaze, his younger daughter, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, and Maura, her brows raised in surprise but her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. They exchanged glances, their body language a mix of caution and curiosity, but none spoke. Behind them, the faint strains of a muted television played a news segment no one was really watching. Shaq gestured toward the hallway. "Guest rooms down there," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that left no room for argument. "You can get cleaned up, get some sleep." Connor's throat worked as he swallowed, his voice catching slightly. I don't want to impose." Shaq's gaze met his, calm and unwavering. "You're not imposing. You're here. That's enough." Connor hesitated a moment longer, then nodded stiffly and followed Shaq's silent gesture down the hall. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with a neatly made bed, a dresser with a few family photos on top, and a small lamp casting a soft glow. Connor stood awkwardly in the doorway, his hands trembling at his sides as he took in the unfamiliar space. He felt the weight of invisible eyes from the living room, the silent questions that hung in the air like smoke, but Shaq said nothing more. Instead, Shaq stood in the hall, watching quietly as Connor stepped inside and closed the door with a faint click. He turned back toward the living room, where his children still watched with guarded expressions. The tension in the air was thick, unspoken yet palpable, each family member waiting for Shaq to explain, to justify this sudden intrusion of a stranger into their space. But he didn't offer explanations. He didn't make speeches. He simply met their gazes, one by one, and gave a subtle shake of his head, as if to say, "Not now." Mara, her arms still folded tightly, was the first to speak, her voice low and wary. "Dad, who is he?" Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line. "Someone who needed a place to land for a bit. That's all." His son shifted uncomfortably. "Is he safe?" Shaq's eyes softened, though his expression remained guarded. "He's safe. For now." The younger daughter exchanged a look with her siblings, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he family?" Shaq hesitated, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. "No," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "Not by blood, but maybe he's part of the story we need to write now." The family fell into a tentative silence, the weight of Shaq's words settling around them like a blanket. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start, a thread of possibility woven into the quiet fabric of their home. As the night deepened, the tension lingered like the fading notes of an unresolved chord. Shaq remained in the living room for a while longer, his thoughts distant, his gaze flickering toward the hallway where Connor slept behind a closed door. He thought of his mother's teachings, of Lucille's unwavering belief in second chances, in the quiet strength of compassion. He thought of his father's promise, the one he'd made years ago, to stand taller in the face of cruelty, to be the kind of man who extended a hand even when it trembled. His children, eventually, drifted off to their rooms, their footsteps quiet on the wooden floors. But Shaq stayed in the living room, the lamp casting a warm halo around him, the house settling into the deep, rhythmic hush of nighttime. He sat on the couch, elbows resting on his knees, and stared into the space where Connor had disappeared, his thoughts a tangle of old hurts and new possibilities. Upstairs, behind the guest room door, Connor lay awake, his body curled on top of the covers, the weight of Shaq's unexpected kindness pressing down on him, like a leaden cloak. He stared at the ceiling, the quiet tick of the bedside clock marking the slow passage of time. For the first time in years, he felt the unfamiliar sting of tears gathering in his eyes, not of self-pity or regret, but of something closer to bewilderment. For all his years of arrogance and defiance, he couldn't comprehend this gesture, this quiet, unspoken offering of shelter, of dignity. The news rippled through the town like a stone cast into still water, sending out waves of curiosity, judgment, and thinly veiled outrage. It began with murmurs at the corner diner, at the barber shop where locals gathered for morning trims and gossip, and then it seeped into church pews, whispered between hymns. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, the hometown hero turned NBA legend, had taken in Connor Steele Braxton, the man who had once spat venomous words at him, the man who had fallen from grace in a cloud of disgrace and scandal. The story twisted through the town's veins, distorted with every retelling. Some said Shaq was playing the saint, offering charity where none was deserved. Others claimed he was just showing off, proving he could afford to lift even the lowest among them. But beneath the surface hum of speculation lay an undercurrent of unease, an old familiar discomfort, a racial divide that had never truly healed, now chafed raw by Shaq's quiet, inexplicable decision. At the local hardware store, a group of older men huddled by the counter, their voices low but sharp-edged. "That boy's always had a bleeding heart," muttered one, a wiry man with a face weathered by years of sun and suspicion. "Thinking he's better than the rest of us, bringing that scum into his home. Just don't make sense," another added, shaking his head. "Connor Braxton ain't done nothing to earn that kind of mercy." Man spat on his own name. "They're both cut from the same cloth," a third sneered, his words barely above a whisper. "Just proves it." The whispers didn't stay confined to the local stores and backroom conversations. An anonymous video had surfaced online, grainy but unmistakable, showing Shaq standing tall and silent beside Connor outside the quiet diner on the edge of town. There was no audio, but the gesture was clear, a silent offering, a steady presence, the image of a man willing to extend a hand when everyone else looked away. The video spread like wildfire, drawing attention far beyond the town's limits. National headlines picked it up. Shaq's shocking act of kindness. An NBA star takes in disgraced rival. Second chances are foolish risks. News vans appeared like vultures, parking along the street outside Shaq's estate, their satellite dishes pointing skyward. Reporters crowding the sidewalks with microphones thrust forward like weapons. Questions flew through the air. Why had Shaq done it? What was his angle? Was it guilt, publicity, some hidden agenda? But Shaq refused them all. He kept his answers brief, his tone firm. "No interviews. This ain't for show," he told the reporters, his broad frame a silent wall against their probing. When they persisted, flashing cameras and baiting questions, he simply turned away, walking back into the house with a calm that defied their expectations. His family stood by him, a united front of quiet defiance, their own expressions a mixture of wariness and pride. Inside the house, the tension lingered. Mira watched the news coverage with a furrowed brow, her arms folded tight across her chest. "They're twisting it," she murmured, her voice low, her frustration bleeding through, making it sound like he's just doing it for attention. Shaq, seated at the kitchen table, with a glass of water in his hand, shook his head slowly. "Let 'em talk," he said quietly. "They don't know what's in here." He tapped his chest lightly, his eyes steady but distant. "This ain't for them. It's not about who's watching." The family exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down like a storm cloud. But they held their silence, bound not by obligation but by something deeper: loyalty. Belief in the quiet integrity that Shaq carried like a mantle. Meanwhile, the town itself wrestled with conflicting emotions. Some admired Shaq's choice, seeing it as a reflection of strength, of grace under pressure. Others resented it, their old prejudices surfacing in muttered comments and narrowed glances. In the church parking lot after Sunday service, groups lingered, debating whether Shaq's gesture was noble or naive. At the school pickup lines, parents whispered behind cupped hands, their tones sharp with judgment and thinly veiled envy. Among the younger crowd, the story sparked a different kind of conversation. Teens shared the video on social media, captions ranging from admiration to sarcasm. "Shaq the real MVP," one post read, accompanied by a fire emoji. Another commented, "Guess even legends got soft spots. Weird flex, but okay." Yet beneath the flippant remarks, a quiet respect simmered, an understanding that what Shaq had done wasn't easy or expected. It was in a way radical. As the days passed, the national media circus intensified. Shaq's name trended online, debates raged on talk shows, and commentators speculated about his motives. But through it all, Shaq maintained his silence, his resolve unshaken. He focused on his family, on the small everyday acts that grounded him, cooking meals, checking on his mother Lucille, playing board games with his kids. The noise outside became a distant hum, a distraction he refused to entertain. Within the walls of his home, Connor remained an uneasy presence. He kept mostly to the guest room, venturing out only for meals or brief conversations. The weight of the town's whispers and his own crushing guilt pressed down on him, making each step heavy, each word a struggle. But Shaq never forced conversation, never demanded explanations. He simply let the silence stretch, offering space without expectation. Late one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Connor stood at the window of the guest room, watching the reporters packing up their gear for the night. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-cheeked, haunted, but slowly, imperceptibly shifting. He thought of the video circulating online, of the town's murmurs and the world's scrutiny, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir beneath the layers of shame and bitterness, a fragile, tentative flicker of possibility. In the quiet darkness of the house, with the low hum of evening settling around them, Shaq's steady voice echoed softly through the walls, speaking not to the cameras, not to the world, but to his family. "This ain't about them," he said. "It's about us, about doing what's right, no matter who's watching." And outside, beyond the estate's gates, the whispers of the town rose and fell, their sharp edges softened by the quiet strength of a man who had chosen to act not for applause, but for something deeper, something that no camera could capture. Days bled into one another, as Connor Braxton's presence, at Shaq's family home, slowly shifted from jarring anomaly to an awkward new reality. The sharp lines of shame that had once defined his face softened with each dawn. With Shaq's quiet insistence, he shaved off the scruffy beard that had grown wild with neglect. His hair was trimmed, his clothes replaced with clean, simple garments. Mealtimes, once tense with unsaid words, became bearable. Connor still spoke little, but his eyes began to lift from the floor, his shoulders less hunched beneath the weight of his disgrace. Shaq's family watched this transformation warily, uncertain whether it signaled genuine change or the thin mask of a man who'd spent too long in his own shadow. Maymara was the first to test him, leaving small acts of kindness on the guest room nightstand. A folded blanket, a cup of hot tea, each a quiet invitation to rejoin the world. Shaq said little, his steady presence enough to fill the silences. Connor, though, felt the slow creep of guilt tightening around his ribs with every simple meal shared, every glance not tinged with accusation. Then, one Sunday morning, Shaq made an unexpected decision. Without warning or fanfare, he invited Connor to accompany him to a local church service. The invitation wasn't spoken, but extended with a simple gesture, a hand lightly resting on Connor's shoulder as Shaq prepared to leave. Connor hesitated, caught between the instinct to retreat and the unfamiliar pull of curiosity. His lips parted to refuse, but the quiet determination in Shaq's gaze stopped him. He nodded, the motion almost imperceptible, and followed Shaq to the waiting car. The church stood at the edge of town, its whitewashed exterior weathered, but resilient. Stained glass windows caught the morning light, casting fractured rainbows on the worn wooden pews inside. The congregation was already gathering, voices murmuring with the familiar blend of hope and routine. As Shaq and Connor entered, heads turned, conversations faltered, then resumed with the practiced ease of a community used to the quiet spectacle of whispered gossip. Shaq, unbothered, led them to a seat near the middle, his posture calm, his presence unshakable. Reverend Ellis took the pulpit as the last of the latecomers settled. His voice, rich and commanding, echoed through the church with a resonance that silenced even the restless children. We gather today not just to seek forgiveness, but to reckon with the truths we hide in the quiet corners of our lives, he said, his gaze sweeping the congregation. His eyes, sharp but not unkind, found Connor where he sat rigid and pale beside Shaq. Some of us carry wounds we've inflicted, scars we've left on others and tried to forget. Connor's throat tightened. He could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against him, the air thick with expectation. Reverend Ellis's words cut deeper, a scalpel of truth slicing through the brittle layers of his pride. Pride is a heavy chain, the preacher continued. It makes us believe we're better than others, that our wrongs can be buried under silence and denial. But pride will choke the life from us if we let it. A low murmur of assent rippled through the pews, but Connor heard nothing beyond the thunderous beat of his own pulse. His hands trembled in his lap, the urge to flee almost overpowering. But then he felt it, a hand, firm and steady, resting lightly on his shoulder. Shaq didn't look at him, didn't speak, but his presence anchored Connor like a lifeline. The silence in the church stretched thick and expectant. Reverend Ellis stepped back from the pulpit, his gaze fixed on Connor with quiet intensity. If there's anyone here who carries a burden too heavy to bear alone, now is the time to speak, he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a challenge. Now is the time to lay it down, not for the world's forgiveness, but for your own soul. The air seemed to crackle around Connor, the weight of his guilt pressing so hard against his chest he thought it might crush him. His lips parted, dry and cracked, and for a long, breathless moment, no sound emerged. Then, in a voice so low it trembled, he spoke. I've wronged a lot of people, he said, the words spilling out rough and uneven. I let my pride ruin me. I let my anger and fear blind me to the harm I caused. A ripple of movement passed through the congregation, some leaning closer, others stiffening. Connor's eyes stung, his vision blurring. I turned my back on the people I should have helped. I hurt folks, publicly and privately, and I never owned up to it because I thought I was too far gone. His voice cracked, a raw edge cutting through the confession. But I'm tired of running. I'm tired of hiding behind what I used to be. Silence swallowed the church, deep and heavy, broken only by the soft creak of pews, as people shifted in their seats. Connor's breath came in shallow, shaking gasps, but he forced himself to continue. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for it, but I needed to say it out loud. I needed to stop pretending. For a long, stretching moment, no one moved. Then quietly, Shaq nodded, just once, slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable but steady. The congregation watched, their collective breath held tight between judgment and grace. Reverend Ellis stepped down from the pulpit, crossing the worn wooden floor with slow, measured steps. He stopped in front of Connor, his face softened with something close to compassion. You spoke truth today, son, Ellis said, his voice quiet but resonant. Truth is the first step toward healing, no matter how far you've fallen. Connor's head bowed, his shoulders trembling with the release of a burden too long carried. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of unspoken stories and private reckonings. Then, slowly, a few heads nodded, murmurs of quiet acknowledgement passing through the pews. It wasn't forgiveness, at least not yet, but it was something, a beginning. As the service ended and the congregation filtered out, whispers rose like smoke through the air. Some voices carried bitterness, others curiosity, but a few, just a few, carried a cautious note of respect. Connor remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the stained glass windows that spilled fractured light across his hands. Beside him, Shaq stood tall, his presence a quiet affirmation of dignity and resilience. You did good today, he said softly, his voice low enough for only Connor to hear. Now, it's what you do next that matters. Outside, the sun shone bright against the weathered walls of the church, and for the first time in years, Connor Braxton felt the fragile pull of possibility. Shaq stood at the edge of his property, his silhouette tall and quiet against the morning glow. In the distance, beyond the quiet hum of waking streets, Connor Braxton walked down the cracked sidewalk in clothes that finally fit his frame, carrying a simple bag slung over his shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Shaq didn't watch him out of curiosity or mistrust. He knew Connor's choice was his own to make, and Shaq's role in it had already been fulfilled. The house had been a refuge, a place for Connor to breathe, to stop running long enough to look himself in the eye. But real change didn't happen in the comfort of borrowed walls. It happened in the small daily acts of penance. That was what Shaq's late father, John O'Neal, had taught him with quiet lessons over kitchen tables and long walks down Georgia dirt roads. In town, Shaq had arranged for Connor to start work with a local non-profit quietly restoring abandoned community centers. It was the kind of work that didn't attract headlines but built trust brick by brick. These old centers had once thrived with laughter and promise, only to crumble when funding dried up, and those in power turned their backs. Now they stood like skeletons, waiting for someone to remember what they were meant to be. Connor would work under the guidance of men and women who knew what it meant to lose faith and fight for it back. One board, one nail, one coat of paint at a time. As Connor approached the first site, a weathered building with peeling paint and windows cracked like old scars, he hesitated at the threshold. His breath caught, and for a moment it seemed the weight of everything might pin him down again. But then a voice called from inside, rough but warm. "You here to help or just admire the ruins?" Connor's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. He nodded, stepping inside with the cautious determination of a man reclaiming a lost part of himself. Back at Shaq's estate, life resumed its quiet rhythm. Mira asked her father over breakfast if Connor was gone for good, and Shaq only said, "He's not gone, just finding his way." His wife Shawnee listened without comment, though her eyes softened as she reached for her husband's hand under the table. Lucille, Shaq's mother, called later that afternoon, her voice low and steady as she offered a few quiet words of approval. Not for the spectacle that some in the media were hoping for, but for the grace Shaq had shown. Whispers traveled quickly, even beyond the sleepy town limits. Across the NBA world, headlines had shifted from scandal and rivalry to something quieter, something more intriguing. The story of a former star quietly lending a hand to a fallen rival without fanfare or interviews. Speculations bloomed. Was it a redemption story? A media stunt? A calculated move? But those who knew Shaq, those who had watched him move through life with a steady blend of humility and resolve, recognized the truth. It wasn't about the cameras or the headline. The media eventually lost interest, chasing newer, flashier stories. The circus packed up and moved on. But the town didn't forget. The old-timers at the barbershop spoke of the day Shaq walked his rival into the church pews. The kids at the school bus stop whispered about the giant who could have crushed a man's pride with a single word, but instead handed him quiet dignity. Weeks passed. Connor's hands grew calloused from labor, his shoulders less hunched beneath shame. He learned to listen, to follow instructions, to laugh without bitterness. The work didn't erase his past. It wasn't supposed to, but it carved out a space for something new to take root. Slowly, cautiously, the town began to see him not as the ghost of disgrace, but as a man quietly trying to make amends. One evening, as Shaq stood at the edge of a rebuilt playground, the sun dipping behind freshly painted swings and slides, Connor approached. He hesitated, clearing his throat like a man unsure of his welcome. "I'm not good at this," Connor admitted, his voice rough but steady. "But I wanted to say thank you for not giving up on me, for giving me a shot when I didn't deserve one." Shaq turned at him, his expression unreadable, but his posture relaxed. "I didn't do it for you," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make Connor flinch. But then, after a beat, Shaq added, "I did it because it was right, and because someone once did the same for me." Connor swallowed hard, nodding once before stepping back into the twilight shadows. He understood. As the stars began to scatter across the sky, Shaq leaned against the playground fence, the quiet hum of the evening settling around him. The town was still flawed, still marked by old scars and silent prejudices. But it was a town moving forward, and for once the path forward wasn't paved with noise and spectacle, but with the simple daily choice to be better than yesterday. Shaq's thoughts drifted to his father again, John O'Neal's quiet strength, his unwavering belief in dignity, his lessons about standing taller not just for oneself, but for others. Redemption, Shaq realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't something that needed applause or headlines. It was a quiet decision, made every morning to step out of the shadows and into the light. He glanced once more toward the rebuilt community center, where Connor's figure was barely visible in the fading light. Hammer in hand, determination etched into his silhouette. "Redemption isn't loud," Shaq murmured to the empty air, his voice soft but steady. "It's a choice, every damn day." And with that he turned back toward home, his stride steady and sure against the cooling breeze of a town quietly learning what it meant to heal. Dive deeper into the hidden truths behind the legends you thought you knew. Discover the power of quiet redemption and the strength it takes to rise after a fall. Stay connected for more stories that peel back the curtain on fame, pride, and the real battles fought away from the spotlight. This is just the beginning. Keep watching, because the next chapter is closer than you think.